As Desmond Ambrose, the conservative barber in the hit sitcom Desmond's, Norman Beaton was Britain's ultimate straight patriarch. But this beloved TV dad was a massive corporate lie. Insiders knew Beaton was secretly navigating London's underground queer scene. However, 1980s television demanded a sanitized, heteronormative product. Stay in the closet or face professional execution. Terrified of tabloids during the AIDS crisis, Beaton suffocated his bisexual identity. He delivered the flawless, straight performance the networks bought, but the terror of that 30-year deception physically destroyed his organs, killing him for primetime perfection. Norman Lugard Beaton was born on October 31, 1934, in Georgetown, Guyana. His father, William Beaton, was a high-ranking civil servant and postmaster. In their household, respectability was the ultimate currency. Flawless conduct and academic perfection were not just encouraged. They were demanded as shields against systemic prejudice. William expected his son to inherit this respectable trajectory, aiming for a secure career in law or government. Norman, however, was fundamentally unsuited for the rigid life his father mapped out. He possessed a sharp intellect but a restless, volatile temperament. Sent to the prestigious Queen's College, the premier educational institution in the country, Beaton actively dismantled his own privileged path. Instead of assimilating into the ranks of future colonial administrators, he clashed with authority. He challenged the curriculum, exhibited a profound lack of discipline, and began drinking heavily at a young age. This outright rejection of his family's values culminated in his expulsion from Queen's College. The expulsion severed his ties to the traditional avenues of middle-class success. Stripped of his academic standing, Beaton pivoted sharply. He turned his back on civil service and threw himself into the visceral, unpolished world of local music. He reinvented himself entirely, adopting the stage persona Calypso Beaton. Forming a band called the 4Bs, he utilized his natural charisma and deep baritone voice to command local stages. This was not a minor hobby. Beaton drove the 4Bs to legitimate commercial success, eventually securing a #1 hit single in Trinidad and Tobago. This era defined his approach to survival. Music provided his first professional mask. He learned how to manipulate an audience, how to control a room, and how to channel his restless energy into a structured public performance. Despite dominating the Caribbean circuit, Beaton's ambitions outgrew his environment. In 1960, at age 26, he left the West Indies for the United Kingdom. He arrived fully expecting his intellect, his education, and his musical success to seamlessly translate into British society. Instead, he hit a brick wall. The British establishment stripped him of his Guyanese status instantly. In 1960s England, a black immigrant was heavily pressured into menial, low-wage labor, regardless of their background. Beaton found himself marginalized and effectively erased. But unlike many who either succumbed to the labor trap or fought the system in the streets, Beaton reacted with cold, academic calculation. He recognized that open, angry defiance would only lead to criminalization. If he wanted to survive, he had to outsmart the establishment. He targeted Liverpool. Bypassing the street-level friction, Beaton weaponized his intellect to force his way into the British professional class. He navigated the bureaucratic hurdles and achieved a historic milestone. He became the first black teacher employed by the Liverpool Education Authority. He had reclaimed his professional respectability, but he refused to be confined by it. While he was a strict, respectable educator during the day, he spent his nights embedding himself in Liverpool's exploding underground music scene. He secured a residency playing guitar at the legendary Cavern Club, placing himself directly in the epicenter of the British Cultural Revolution. This dual existence, the authority figure at the blackboard by day, the entertainer in the smoky club by night, was not a contradiction to Beaton. It was a reconnaissance mission. From the stage and the classroom, he studied the British public. He learned their anxieties, their humor, and their rigid class dynamics. Beaton was actively gathering the psychological intelligence he would later use to infiltrate the highest, most guarded levels of British theatre and television. He had established his beachhead, and he was ready to move. Armed with a deep observational understanding of the British public from his time in Liverpool, Norman Beaton launched his assault on the country's cultural establishment. He understood that in the United Kingdom, true power did not reside in the underground music clubs or even in the political arenas. It resided on the classical stage. The theatre was the fortress of the British elite, a heavily guarded institution where classical training was weaponized to maintain class boundaries. For a black actor in the 1970s, the stage offered little more than novelty parts or silent background dressing. Beaton refused to accept this marginalization. He did not simply want a job as an actor. He wanted to conquer the fortress. He targeted the absolute pinnacle of this hierarchy, the plays of William Shakespeare. For the British arts establishment, Shakespeare was sacred ground. To master it was to prove an intellectual equality that the colonial mindset desperately wanted to deny him. Beaton relentlessly pursued classical roles, forcing casting directors to acknowledge his formidable intellect and commanding baritone. He broke down the institutional doors of the National Theatre, landing the complex role of Ariel in The Tempest. But his definitive theatrical coup came in 1981, when he starred as the tyrannical Angelo in a historic production of Measure for Measure. This was the first time a Shakespearean play at the National Theatre was performed by an entirely black cast. Beaton used his growing influence to actively challenge the funding structures of the British arts. In 1975, he co-founded the Black Theatre of Brixton. He openly and fiercely criticized the hypocrisy of government and corporate sponsors. He noted with sharp clarity that the British establishment was more than willing to pour millions of pounds into building sports arenas to watch black men box or run, but they aggressively withheld funding for literature, theater, and education in marginalized neighborhoods. Beaton demanded to be recognized not as a black actor hired to fulfill a diversity quota, but as a master of the human condition. Yet, as he transitioned from the prestige of the classical stage to the mass reach of television, Beaton slammed into a highly sophisticated trap. The television broadcasting apparatus operated on entirely different rules than the theater. Network executives were not interested in his Shakespearean depth or his radical critiques of the class system. They were interested in maintaining the social status quo and selling advertising space. When Beaton first entered the television industry in the early 1970s, he was subjected to a systematic process of stereotyping designed to keep actors of color firmly at the bottom of the narrative hierarchy. The industry effectively attempted to criminalize or impoverish his image. He was repeatedly handed what were bluntly known as ghetto roles. In 30 Minutes Worth, 1973, he was cast as a trained security guard. In The Protectors, 1974, he played a chauffeur. In Barlow at Large, 1974, he was typecast as a drug dealer. For a man who had mastered the linguistic complexities of the National Theatre, being handed scripts that required him to play an uneducated thug was a profound psychological insult. Beaton recognized that if he remained in these roles, he would never gain the national leverage he sought. He needed a vehicle that placed him at the center of the narrative. That breakthrough arrived in 1976 with The Fosters, the first British sitcom to feature an all-black main cast, followed closely by his work in Empire Road. Eventually, this trajectory would lead him to the defining role of his career, the barbershop owner in the massive hit Desmond's. He had finally secured a platform that reached millions of living rooms across the nation. But stepping into the role of the leading man required signing an implicit, ironclad contract with the media machinery. The networks offered him wealth, national fame, and unprecedented influence, but the price was his total compliance with a highly specific public image. The British broadcasting system needed a cultural ambassador, but one who was entirely safe. They constructed a heteronormative box around Beaton and forced him inside. To secure the primetime slot, he had to embody the archetype of the traditional conservative patriarch. On screen, he was directed to be jovial, occasionally grumpy but fundamentally harmless, a man fiercely protective of family values and traditional morality. The PR machinery of the era went into overdrive to sell this illusion. Interviews were heavily vetted. Press releases focused relentlessly on his status as a family man. The networks effectively utilized unwritten morality clauses, his continued employment, and the employment of the entire cast beneath him depended entirely on his ability to project a flawless, straight, conventional lifestyle off-camera. The pressure attached to this illusion was staggering. Beaton was acutely aware that he was carrying the commercial viability of Black British television on his shoulders. Studio bosses made it clear, often through subtle manipulation, that if his show failed, or if a personal scandal erupted, they would use it as hard evidence that audiences were not ready for diverse programming. If Beaton slipped, the doors would close for an entire generation of performers behind him. Furthermore, the industry held all the leverage. When executives arbitrarily decided to cancel projects or slash budgets, the network PR teams would instantly spin the narrative, leaking details that blamed Beaton for being difficult or uncooperative. The actor was always positioned to take the fall for the boardroom's failures. Beaton was fully trapped. The classical scholar had successfully hijacked the national broadcasting system, but to keep his hands on the wheel, he had to play the role of the smiling, straight, uncomplicated father figure. It was a flawless commercial product, carefully engineered so that white audiences never felt threatened. But beneath the surface of this manufactured respectability, the psychological friction of living a total lie was beginning to generate a dangerous, uncontrollable heat. The official narrative of Norman Beaton's private life was a masterclass in public relations. On paper, his existence aligned perfectly with the traditional patriarchal image he projected on screen. He had a sprawling, conventional family structure, having been married 3 times, fathering 5 children, and sharing a long-term domestic partnership with a woman named Jane Cash, whom he publicly designated as his fiancée. This network of wives, children, and a stable female partner served as the ultimate commercial shield. It provided network executives with the photographic evidence they needed to market him to a conservative nation. However, far away from the television studios and the carefully curated family portraits, a parallel, deeply guarded reality operated in the shadows. To understand the sheer danger of Beaton's off-camera existence, one must first understand the predatory nature of the British media landscape in the 1980s and early 1990s. Fleet Street, the epicenter of the UK tabloid press, did not operate as a standard journalistic corps. It functioned as a highly incentivized surveillance state. Tabloid editors commanded massive budgets specifically allocated to destroy the reputations of public figures. The societal climate was defined by a ruthless, weaponized moral panic. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government had enacted Section 28, a legislative mandate that strictly prohibited the promotion of homosexuality, essentially codifying anti-gay sentiment into national law. Simultaneously, the early years of the HIV/AIDS epidemic had generated a hysterical, fear-driven public discourse. Within this hostile environment, non-traditional sexuality was not merely viewed as a private matter. It was treated as a severe moral failing and a public health threat. For a high-profile black man carrying the burden of community representation, navigating this landscape was like walking through a minefield. While his official biographies centered on domesticity, a persistent, unspoken reality existed within the tight-knit circles of the British entertainment industry. Industry insiders and many close to him noted that Beaton navigated a highly complex clandestine life, with widespread suggestions that he actively participated in the underground LGBT scene as a bisexual man. He was trapped at a brutal intersection of race, class, and sexuality. The mainstream, white-dominated gay scene in London was often exclusionary and deeply prejudiced, offering no safe harbor for a black immigrant. Conversely, the West Indian community in Britain, fiercely battling systemic racism, heavily relied on the politics of respectability and strict religious conservatism to maintain its dignity in a hostile country. Any deviation from strict heterosexuality was viewed not just as a personal sin, but as a liability that could damage the collective reputation of the entire community. Beaton was a man without a true sanctuary, forced to compartmentalize his identity into airtight, isolated fractions. This isolation necessitated the use of a hidden ecosystem. The queer underground of 1980s London operated on a strict system of coded language, discrete entryways, and absolute discretion. It was an infrastructure built for survival. Venues were not advertised. They were discovered through highly guarded whispers. Entrance often required passing physical vetting by bouncers, who scrutinized every patron for signs of journalistic intent or undercover law enforcement. For a man with one of the most recognizable faces on British television, entering this world required extreme operational security. Beaton could not simply walk into a known establishment. The logistics of his private life demanded the precision of an espionage operation. It required staggered arrivals, cash-only transactions to avoid paper trails, and a heavy reliance on a network of facilitators. This is where the psychological toll became staggering. To maintain a secret life, a public figure must employ an inner circle of fixers, drivers, security personnel, makeup artists, and trusted confidants who know the truth and help facilitate the logistics. But every person brought into the circle is a potential leak. The power dynamic inherently flips. The wealthy, famous actor suddenly becomes completely dependent on the silence of his subordinates. Beaton lived with the suffocating realization that a single disgruntled employee, an underpaid driver, or a jealous acquaintance could walk into a Fleet Street newspaper office and sell his secret for tens of thousands of pounds. The paranoia was not an irrational fear. It was a daily, mathematical calculation of risk. Tabloid journalists regularly paid off bartenders, club coat check staff, and hotel concierges for tips. Paparazzi utilized long-lens cameras to shoot through restaurant windows and parked cars. If a photograph of Beaton in a compromising scenario with another man reached a news desk, the consequences would be instantaneous and absolute. It would not result in a sympathetic public conversation. The networks would invoke the unwritten morality clauses of his contract. Desmond's would be pulled from syndication. His co-stars would lose their livelihoods, and his legacy as a trailblazer would be aggressively overwritten by the tabloids, reducing him to a punchline of moral decay. The sheer terror of this impending professional execution dictated his every movement outside of his home. The psychological weight of this existence forced Beaton into a state of permanent hypervigilance. He was effectively functioning as a high-value asset operating behind enemy lines, constantly scanning his environment for threats. The cheerful, relaxed demeanor he projected to the public was an exhaustive performance. He had to analyze every conversation, second-guess every new acquaintance, and constantly monitor his own behavior to ensure no trace of his underground life bled into his daytime persona. He was building immense wealth and unprecedented cultural influence, but he was doing so inside a glass closet. He could see the world, and the world could see him, but the walls were rigid, cold, and entirely inescapable. The mental bandwidth required to keep his official family narrative intact, appease the network executives, dodge the tabloid surveillance, and satisfy his own repressed human desires created a catastrophic internal pressure. Beaton had engineered a brilliant survival strategy to conquer the British media, but the architecture of his own lie was slowly transforming into a prison from which he could not escape. The system had not broken him physically yet, but it had entirely cornered his mind. The British television industry in the 1970s and 1980s was not merely a cultural institution. It was a highly concentrated corporate monopoly. Power was centralized in the boardrooms of a few major networks, and executives wielded absolute authority over the careers of their talent. In this arena, leverage was the ultimate currency. Studio bosses did not simply hire actors. They acquired assets and managed liabilities. For Norman Beaton, the power dynamic was inherently asymmetrical. The networks held the capital, the distribution channels, and the public relations machinery. Beaton held only his talent. To maintain dominance, the system required complete control over its stars, and to control Norman Beaton, the media establishment weaponized his own legal and financial history. Beaton's vulnerabilities extended far beyond the private whispers regarding his sexuality. He possessed a documented, public, and highly damaging legal history that stood in direct, glaring contrast to the respectable, law-abiding patriarch he portrayed on screen. In his own autobiography, Beaton bluntly categorized himself as a former convict and a con man, a rare admission that highlighted the precarious foundation of his stardom. His criminal record was not a secret to the executives who employed him. It was a calculated risk they chose to underwrite, and subsequently, a chain they used to secure his compliance. The rap sheet was extensive and varied. In 1965, years before he achieved national television prominence, Beaton was convicted of check fraud and sentenced to 9 months in prison. This was not a minor misdemeanor, but a serious felony that placed him firmly within the penal system. 2 years later, in 1967, he was back in court, convicted of larceny, and sentenced to another 6 months behind bars. For a black immigrant in the UK during the 1960s, a prison record was typically an inescapable death sentence for any professional ambition. The criminal justice system of the era was notoriously biased, and a conviction permanently branded an individual as unemployable in the eyes of the white-collar establishment. When Beaton transitioned into television, these convictions became the ultimate corporate trump card. Network legal departments structured talent contracts with ironclad morality clauses. These clauses stipulated that any behavior bringing the network into disrepute, whether past or present, was grounds for immediate termination without compensation. The studio bosses knew about the fraud. They knew about the larceny. By hiring him, they essentially granted him a pardon. But it was a conditional pardon heavily mortgaged against his future obedience. This leverage dictated the financial realities of his career. Despite being the anchor of groundbreaking, highly rated programming, Beaton's compensation rarely reflected his actual value to the network. The executives knew he had no alternative buyers. If he demanded equity, syndication rights, or pay parity with white actors of similar stature, the network could easily threaten to leak the details of his criminal past to the tabloids, framing him as a deceptive, unrepentant fraudster unfit for family television. He was forced to accept lower salaries and grueling production schedules because the threat of total professional annihilation was always sitting silently on the negotiating table. The financial strain of this systemic underpayment manifested brutally in his personal life. Beaton was required to maintain the outward appearance of a successful, wealthy television star. He had to dress the part, live in the right neighborhoods, and support a sprawling family infrastructure. Yet he was earning a fraction of what his white contemporaries commanded. This economic disparity, combined with poor financial management, pushed him to the brink of ruin. In 1982, the facade cracked publicly when Beaton was forced to declare bankruptcy, listing debts totaling £21,000. Bankruptcy court records in the UK are public domain. The Fleet Street tabloids, always eager to dismantle a black success story, consumed the news. The financial collapse was a public humiliation that severely damaged his bargaining power. A bankrupt actor is a desperate actor, and network executives exploited this desperation. They knew he needed the paycheck to appease his creditors, locking him into multi-season contracts on terms dictated entirely by the studio. The bankruptcy transformed him from an independent artist into an indentured employee of the broadcasting system. The legal troubles did not stop at financial ruin. The pressure cooker of his existence, juggling a hidden private life, a public bankruptcy, and the demands of network television, resulted in increasingly erratic behavior. In 1979, he was arrested and convicted for drunk driving. While seemingly minor compared to his earlier prison stints, a DUI arrest for a public figure in the UK was a severe PR liability. It was a tangible crack in the armor of the respectable patriarch. However, the ultimate test of the system's grip occurred when Beaton was indicted on massive fraud charges concerning the legendary American musician Ray Charles. Beaton was accused of orchestrating an elaborate scam, allegedly defrauding tour organizers out of substantial funds by falsely claiming to represent the singer and organize UK performances. This was a high-stakes international scandal. If convicted, it would have meant years in a maximum security prison and the absolute end of his career. The media circus surrounding the trial was vicious. The establishment press was primed to write the final chapter on the fallen star. The power dynamics in the courtroom were incredibly hostile. Beaton was a black television star facing down the British legal establishment. Against massive odds, Beaton was acquitted. The jury found him not guilty, clearing him of all charges related to the Ray Charles tour. Yet, the legal victory was entirely Pyrrhic. In the entertainment industry, the process is the punishment. The legal fees devastated what little remained of his finances. The trial dragged his name through months of negative tabloid speculation, fundamentally altering how the public and the network viewed him. The acquittal meant he kept his freedom, but he lost whatever remaining leverage he had over his career. The network bosses had stood by him during the trial, not out of loyalty, but out of commercial necessity. They needed him to finish his contracted seasons. But in their eyes, he was now damaged goods. He owed them his professional survival, cornered by his legal history, financially indentured by his bankruptcy, and terrified of his private life being exposed. Beaton found himself in an inescapable corporate stranglehold. He could not fight the networks in the boardroom. They held all the ammunition. Therefore, he launched his counteroffensive in the only space where he retained absolute control, directly in front of the camera lens. Beaton was a master of the theatrical Trojan horse. He realized that the networks only cared about the demographic data and the advertising revenue. They rarely scrutinized the intellectual mechanics of the performance itself. He took the scripts provided to him, often basic, conventional situational comedy written by white writers aiming for broad, unchallenging laughs, and weaponized them. Drawing heavily upon his years, studying Shakespeare and the rhythm of classical theater, Beaton altered the delivery of his lines. He employed highly specific syncopated pacing, dramatic pauses, and physical micro-expressions that completely subverted the written text. He transformed simple jokes into biting, sarcastic indictments of Thatcher's Britain. When playing Desmond Ambrose, a line about the weather or the price of a haircut was delivered with a sharp, underlying irony that directly mocked the systemic racism and classist hypocrisy of the very society consuming the show. He was executing a high-wire act of psychological manipulation. The white, middle-class audience sat in their living rooms, laughing comfortably at what they perceived to be a jovial black barber. They felt safe. They felt entertained. But they were entirely unaware that the man on the screen was using his academic brilliance to actively mock their worldview. Beaton turned the stereotype inside out, using the safe character as a vehicle to deliver radical, subversive commentary directly into the heart of the British establishment. This was the ultimate boardroom standoff. The executives believed they had successfully neutered a radical artist, chaining him to a sitcom set with the threat of legal and financial exposure. But Beaton had hijacked their multi-million-pound broadcast signal to wage a covert intellectual war against the system itself. It was a brilliant, defiant survival tactic. However, executing this permanent double cross, waging a covert war against the very hand that fed him, required a level of psychological endurance that no human body could sustain indefinitely. The systemic grip had failed to break his mind, so it inevitably began to crush his physical form. The human body is an unforgiving biological ledger. It keeps an exact, merciless account of every psychological compromise, every suppressed truth, and every instance of sustained neurological stress. For Norman Beaton, the architecture of his survival was built entirely in the mind, but the bill for that survival was inevitably charged to his physical form. He had spent decades executing a high-stakes psychological war against the British broadcasting system, navigating the treacherous waters of tabloid surveillance, legal jeopardy, and the suffocating demands of the respectability politics that kept him employed. He outsmarted the boardroom, but he could not outsmart his own biology. The sheer friction of his compartmentalized existence began to systematically dismantle him. To survive the daily reality of his life in the 1980s and early 1990s, Beaton required a coping mechanism. The intense hypervigilance required to maintain his straight, respectable, unproblematic public persona while simultaneously guarding a deeply complex, legally precarious, and potentially queer private life generated a permanent state of fight or flight within his nervous system. He could never power down. To dampen this overwhelming internal noise, Beaton relied heavily on substances. This was not the recreational partying associated with standard celebrity excess. It was clinical self-medication. It was an anesthesia applied to a bleeding psychological wound. His primary tools of regulation were heavy alcohol consumption and chain smoking. In the context of British television production during that era, both were culturally normalized, making them the perfect, invisible crutches. The pub was the center of post-production life, and green rooms were clouded with cigarette smoke. Beaton utilized this environment to self-medicate in plain sight. Alcohol served as the necessary depressant to quiet the chronic paranoia of tabloid exposure and the financial terror of his bankruptcy. Tobacco provided the constant, rhythmic dopamine hits required to sustain his focus through grueling, multi-camera taping schedules. He was fundamentally using chemical intervention to artificially sustain a pace and a persona that his natural constitution had long since rejected. This physical deterioration occurred against the darkest possible historical backdrop. The late 1980s and early 1990s marked the terrifying apex of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The disease was cutting a devastating swathe through the global artistic community, and the public discourse surrounding it was characterized by profound ignorance, moral panic, and a ruthless hunt for the infected. The British tabloid press had essentially weaponized the virus, monitoring the fluctuating weight and physical appearance of public figures with predatory intensity. Any male celebrity, particularly one operating with the underground rumors that trailed Beaton, who showed signs of sudden aging, extreme fatigue, or weight loss, was immediately subjected to vicious, career-ending speculation. This environment created an agonizing secondary layer of pressure. Beaton was not simply managing his failing health. He was forced to aggressively mask it. If his physical exhaustion was misconstrued by the media as an AIDS-related illness, the network would panic. The conservative family audience that fueled Desmond's would recoil, and his hard-won financial stability would evaporate overnight. Therefore, every cough on set, every moment of visible exhaustion had to be explained away. He could not afford to look sick in an era where sickness was equated with moral failure. The effort required to project robust, patriarchal vitality while his internal organs were effectively staging a mutiny accelerated his overall decline. The British television production machine, meanwhile, recognized no human limits. Network television operates as an industrial factory, and Desmond's was its most reliable assembly line. The multi-camera sitcom format is notoriously demanding. It requires long hours of blocking under intensely hot studio lighting, precise memorization of continuously rewritten dialogue, and the explosive, performative energy necessary to command a live studio audience during tape nights. As the lead of the show, Beaton carried the absolute center of gravity for the entire production. He was in his late 50s, hauling a history of heavy smoking and drinking, yet expected to deliver the comedic agility of a man half his age. The breaking point arrived in 1993. Beaton was temporarily stepping away from the barbershop to film a Channel 4 comedy drama titled Little Napoleons. The production schedule was rigorous, and the physical toll of his lifestyle finally overwhelmed his biological defenses. Beaton did not just experience fatigue, his system suffered a catastrophic failure. He collapsed entirely on the set. The medical reality of his collapse stripped away all the illusions of his television persona. He was rushed to the hospital and immediately transferred to the intensive care unit, ICU. He remained there for 7 agonizing weeks. This was not a minor health scare or a routine period of exhaustion. A 7-week ICU admission indicates a profound systemic breakdown of major organ function. The classically trained Shakespearean actor, the man whose booming baritone voice had commanded the stage of the National Theater, was reduced to a fragile patient dependent on machines to keep oxygen flowing through his bloodstream. Yet, the sheer brutality of the media system is defined by its refusal to allow its assets to rest. Even as Beaton lay in the ICU, the machinery of Desmond's was calculating its margins. The network had contracted obligations, syndication targets, and advertising slots to fill. Beaton's financial indenture, the lingering shadows of his public bankruptcy, and his complex family obligations meant he fundamentally could not afford to remain incapacitated. As soon as he was medically stabilized, the pressure to return to work was immense. By an act of staggering, almost incomprehensible willpower, Beaton forced himself out of the hospital bed and back onto the soundstage to film the 6th series of Desmond's. The return to the set was a grotesque intersection of human suffering and commercial necessity. Industry insiders and crew members observed a man who was physically hollowed out. The network made subtle, clinical accommodations to extract the final performances from him. The blocking of the scenes was quietly altered. Beaton was increasingly seated during his scenes, propped up behind the barber's chair rather than commanding the floor. The dynamic, physical comedy of the earlier seasons was replaced by a static, heavily edited performance designed to hide his total lack of stamina. He was dying on camera, yet he was contractually obligated to keep making the nation laugh. The cruelty of the arrangement was absolute. The system did not allow him to show weakness because weakness would shatter the lucrative illusion of the invulnerable black patriarch they were selling to the world. Beaton was trapped inside the character of Desmond Ambrose, forced to wear the man's sweaters and deliver his catchphrases while his own lungs effectively turned to stone. Eventually, the medical reality could no longer be disguised by lighting or editing. Beaton was forced to publicly disclose that he was suffering from severe emphysema. The disease is a chronic, progressive condition that fundamentally destroys the air sacs in the lungs, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. For an actor, the breath is the primary instrument of their craft. It is the engine of the voice and the regulator of the performance. Emphysema attacks the very core of an actor's capability. The diagnosis was a grim final sentence. The irony was devastating. The man who had survived the racial hostility of 1960s Liverpool, the elitism of the British theatrical establishment, the predatory tactics of Fleet Street tabloids, and the boardroom manipulations of network executives, was finally silenced by his own failing respiratory system. The damage inflicted by years of the anesthesia required to survive the industry had claimed its final price. Recognizing that his body had been entirely depleted of its resources and completely incapable of standing under the studio lights, for another hour, Norman Beaton officially announced his retirement. The broadcasting machine had successfully extracted the absolute maximum yield from his talent, leaving behind a completely broken vessel. By the winter of 1994, The elaborate architecture of Norman Beaton's life had entirely collapsed. His body, ravaged by advanced emphysema and decades of relentless self-medication, could no longer support the demands of the British television industry. He was forced into retirement, confined to his home, and reliant on a brutal regimen of medical interventions simply to draw breath. The man who had once dominated the stage at the National Theatre was now a prisoner of his own failing physiology. Recognizing the terminal trajectory of his illness, Beaton made a final, definitive calculation. He refused to die within the borders of the country that had simultaneously elevated and systematically dismantled him. In December 1994, he initiated the logistics for a final journey back to his birthplace, Georgetown, Guyana. This decision was not merely an act of nostalgic sentimentality. It was a desperate reclamation of his origins. Returning to the Caribbean was the only way to bypass the British media's inevitable death watch. Beaton understood the predatory mechanics of Fleet Street tabloids. Had he remained in London, his final days would have been subjected to ruthless surveillance. Paparazzi would have staked out his residence, attempting to capture photographs of the once powerful patriarch, reduced to a skeletal, oxygen-dependent invalid. The press would have dissected his physical decay, searching for visual confirmation of the persistent underground rumors regarding his private life and potential AIDS-related complications, regardless of his actual emphysema diagnosis. By leaving the United Kingdom, he was executing one last strategic maneuver to protect whatever dignity he had left from the lens of the tabloid cameras. The journey itself was a severe medical risk. Commercial air travel, with its pressurized cabins and fluctuating oxygen levels, is highly dangerous for a patient with end-stage emphysema. Yet, the urgency to escape the British ecosystem overrode all clinical advice. Beaton boarded the transatlantic flight, enduring hours of physiological torture. The grim irony of his life was that it ended with the abrupt, unceremonious pacing of a television script. On December 13, 1994, shortly after his flight landed at the airport in Georgetown, his heart finally surrendered to the catastrophic lack of oxygen. He collapsed in the terminal, dying at the age of 60, just hours after touching the soil of his homeland. He had outrun the British press, but his escape was measured only in minutes. The moment his heart stopped, the broadcast industry's public relations machinery immediately activated. When an asset of Beaton's magnitude dies, a network does not mourn. It executes a crisis management protocol. Channel 4 and the production companies associated with Desmond's held an immensely valuable property. The sitcom was a syndication goldmine, slated to be broadcast across international markets for decades. However, the commercial viability of that property relied entirely on preserving the pristine, unproblematic image of Desmond Ambrose. The true Norman Beaton, the radical intellectual, the bisexual man navigating an underground ecosystem, the former convict, the bankrupt artist who actively mocked white British respectability, was a massive commercial liability. The system needed to bury the man to save the character. The posthumous erasure of Beaton's complex identity was executed with surgical, bloodless efficiency. Within hours of his death, carefully crafted press releases were disseminated to the major news outlets. These statements strictly centered on his role as a television pioneer, heavily emphasizing his status as a dedicated family man and a cheerful trailblazer for Black British comedy. Any mention of his fierce political radicalism, his co-founding of the Black Theatre of Brixton to combat systemic arts defunding, or his vocal criticisms of the British class structure was systematically excised from the official obituaries. The ultimate act of corporate whitewashing occurred just 6 days after his collapse in Guyana. On December 19, 1994, Channel 4 preempted its regular programming to broadcast a hastily assembled tribute documentary titled Beaten but Unbowed. To the untrained eye, the program appeared to be a respectful, emotional farewell to a beloved actor. In reality, it was a masterclass in narrative sanitization. The tribute meticulously curated a version of Beaton that was entirely palatable to Middle England. The broadcast featured warm anecdotes from co-stars and industry executives, all reinforcing the illusion of the jovial, harmless patriarch. The documentary entirely ignored the crushing psychological toll of his career. It made no mention of the ironclad morality clauses that had kept him trapped in a heteronormative performance off-camera. It conveniently omitted the grueling production schedules that had placed him in an intensive care unit just a year prior. It bypassed his devastating 1982 bankruptcy and his highly publicized criminal trials. Most importantly, it actively silenced the profound, unspoken realities of his sexuality and the immense paranoia he endured navigating the AIDS crisis within the conservative media landscape of the 1980s. The media establishment effectively froze him in amber. By controlling the narrative in the immediate aftermath of his death, the network ensured that the historical record would reflect only the sanitized product they had manufactured. They did not simply mourn him. They successfully retrofitted his legacy to serve their future quarterly earnings. In death, Norman Beaton was permanently stripped of his humanity, his flaws, his radicalism, and his secret loves. He was reduced to a two-dimensional mascot, ensuring that millions of viewers could continue to laugh at reruns of Desmond's without ever having to confront the brutal, tragic reality of the man who gave his life to entertain them. Norman Beaton was an intellectual giant forced to play a court jester in a kingdom that despised him. His legacy is an enduring, uncomfortable testament to the absolute ruthlessness of the modern entertainment complex. He achieved what was widely considered impossible. He breached the unyielding walls of the British theatrical establishment, conquered the national broadcasting network, and fundamentally forced the integration of black narratives into mainstream primetime television. He paved the way for generations of diverse talent who walked through the doors he battered down. Yet, the price of that entry was his own soul. The media machinery did not merely demand his labor, it demanded the total surrender of his authentic self. To survive the predatory tabloid culture, the structural racism of the boardrooms, and the suffocating respectability politics of his era, Beaton had to fracture his identity. He lived a life of agonizing hypervigilance, hiding his sexuality and his radical politics behind the comforting mask of a conservative sitcom father. He relied on the anesthesia of substance abuse to endure the psychological friction of this permanent performance, ultimately destroying his own body to maintain the broadcast schedule of a corporation that viewed him only as a line item on a ledger. His life serves as a chilling, profound warning about the invisible contracts signed in the pursuit of mainstream power. The tragedy of Norman Beaton is not just that he died prematurely, exhausted, and physically hollowed out. The true tragedy is the sheer violence of his erasure. He outsmarted the British class system, but in the end, the capitalist broadcasting machine won the final edit, burying a revolutionary artist beneath the smiling, marketable ghost of Desmond Ambrose. The cameras captured his image, but the system stole his truth.